Hey, it's Chris, the Supply Chain Doctor. Over the years, I've interviewed some of the brightest minds and successful leaders in supply chain management. In May 2020, I sat down with supply chain leader Ken Ackerman to learn more about him and collect a little supply chain management history. After the interview, Ken told me about a similar interview he had with Dr. Jim Stock many years prior, and the related work Dr. Stock did. In November 2020, I was able to catch up with Dr. Stock to learn about him and his work. As an academic in the world of transportation, logistics, and what we now call supply chain management, Jim was well connected to many of the original academic thought leaders in the space. Jim did interviews with many of these thought leaders and shared them with me. The list includes Ken Ackerman, Don Bowersox, James Heskett, Bud Lalonde, John Langley Jr., Tom Menser, Tom Spee, and Daniel Wren. To carry on the great work started by Dr. Jim Stock, I'm dusting off these interviews and bringing them to you to help you get a better understanding of supply chain management and hopefully become a more effective supply chain professional.
What's your most fond memory of the military?
The fond memory is the relationships with other people that you form. Being drafted, we had a highly diverse set of people. These were not people who had selected themselves into the Army. The characters that I will probably never forget. But I think, too, the certain discipline. I probably needed a little of that. Things as simple as making your bed and keeping your area policed around that bed, which probably influenced the way I've behaved ever since. But then there was also the aspect of travel. I think the Army gave me a much more worldly view that I've never lost. In fact, it sort of paved the way for a lifetime of travel and an attempt to understand how other people think and speak and eat, all that sort of thing.
So in sum, it would appear that you view that as a very positive experience in your life.
I wouldn't have missed it for anything. Wouldn't want to do it again necessarily, but I wouldn't have missed it for anything.
Okay. You mentioned going from the military into the MBA program at Stanford and working with Gaten Germain, who was one of the early people in logistics starting out in transportation. You mentioned his influence, working for him as sort of a secretary. How did he influence you to sort of concentrate on that area in your area of study?
Well, it was a short step from working with him as a secretary to working with him and his protege, Nick Glaskowski, as a case writer, preparing materials. They had been very good about making sure that I became acquainted with some of the members of the executive program class, this transportation management program. They suggested that maybe I follow up with some of those people and explore the possibility of writing cases. There were some other people that they also encouraged to join this group, a guy named Bob Ivey, who later became head of United Vintners, a large wine-producing organization in California, a fellow named John Morgridge, who later became CEO and chairman of Cisco Systems in the 90s. In other words, a group of people who interacted in ways that sort of led to an expectation of bigger things. And I think Gaten Germain really, being a young, successful member of the Stanford Business School faculty, sort of instilled in us the idea that you can do anything. This place is wide open as an opportunity, and you ought to take advantage of it.
Okay, so based upon that MBA experience and working with Gaten Germain, that is what sort of was the catalyst to get you into the advanced degree?
He took me aside and suggested one day that I consider going on for a doctorate. I think my first question was, I don't know what that means. And he described for me what the life of an academic might be like and expressed confidence that I could complete the program and provided basically the inspiration. He was an example of what one could do at a young age, at an age that seems young now.
Mm-hmm.
He was the spark that put me forward. He'd be one of the few people in my life who really influenced the course of my work.
So no regrets leaving that retailing career behind as you had anticipated?
Oh yeah, a lot of regrets. I've regretted that all my life. In fact, only through my board work have I been able to get back to it. I've served on the boards of companies called Brooks Fashion, that goes back a ways, Office Depot, Limited Brands. I'm partial to retailing in that respect, and I suppose that's been a way for me to work out the frustrations of never having been able to get into the store and manage one.
So in this doctoral program that Gayton Germain sort of got you into this interest in being a professor, how did you get that first process you went through in getting that first academic position?
In those days, you were not supposed to write letters on your own behalf. There was a philosophy at Stanford that it didn't even make much difference if you went to the academic meetings, that what was really important was that you have a sponsor write a letter on your behalf. And I had a fellow named David Faville, who was a professor of marketing at the school at that time, write some letters on my behalf. Gayton Germain wrote some letters, probably made a phone call or two, and I ended up with, as I recall, 3 offers from that process: the University of New Hampshire, University of Michigan, and Ohio State University. I recall going up to the University of New Hampshire during something called the Winter Carnival up there, getting off the train and stepping into a 5-foot snowbank on a campus where it seemed to me the students were almost as cold as the weather. So that was one of my experiences. And so my major choice was between Michigan and Ohio State.
And how did you make that decision?
I made the decision based on my interaction with the people on both of those faculties. They I think, were both quite hospitable, although there was a feeling of warmth at Ohio State that sort of encouraged me to want to join that faculty, even though I think it was the lowest of the 3 offers that I received. I'll never forget the starting wage at that time. It was $7,200. I thought that was, sure, a bit of a sacrifice from $7,600 or whatever Michigan had offered, but I was willing to give up the $400 for the collegial atmosphere. And at Ohio State, there were people like Bill Davidson, Art Kullman, Ted Beckman in the marketing group at that time who were particularly welcoming. There was no one in logistics, so I didn't have anyone to welcome me. A course in transportation was being taught by a motor carrier executive, a fellow named James Riley, called him Ralph Riley, who always claimed that I got his job. I think he was always joking about it. I was never quite sure. Nevertheless, it was a collegial atmosphere there.
So when Ohio State hired you, did they hire you specifically to teach the transportation course plus other marketing courses, or what was the specific position that they wanted you for?
It was basically to teach that course and to teach marketing as well. At Ohio State, as at many other schools, there was very little concern about how you taught or what you taught, as long as it was within the subject area. You were basically king, in my case, king of your domain. So I was able to teach transportation, but slowly bring in the logistics material as well. In marketing, I believe I taught a basic marketing course and MBA marketing as well.
You know, Jim, as we mentioned in overviewing your career, in 1965, you took a leave to form this logistics consulting firm. What was the motivation to do that? And then subsequent to that, going to Harvard as opposed to staying at Ohio State?
Well, let me just correct the sequence just a bit.
Okay.
I did leave Ohio State, but I took a visiting position at Harvard.
Okay.
And it was during the time of that associate professorship, essentially, which extended for several years, that I actually took the leave to head up this group called Business Logistics. So I had, in a sense, moved geographically and established this group in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Okay.
My colleagues thought I was out of my mind. It was an opportunity that came along. I suppose I've always had the desire to be a practitioner in the back of my mind, and this was an opportunity to put together a group to do some consulting in logistics, because I was up for tenure and full rank during the time that I was away from campus. So that was not considered by my colleagues at Harvard to be a good move, a wise move. I had one close colleague, a guy named Bob Bazell, with whom I had, who had taught at Ohio State. Bob I had just missed him there, but who advised me not to leave at that time. And I said, well, you know, Bob, they're either going to promote me or they're not on the basis of what I've already done, and this is something I'd really like to do. So I was actually promoted while I was away from campus.
Now, it's interesting, Jim, you used the term logistics. And we know at that time most folks thought physical distribution. The inbound side was not really considered.
Right.
When did you sort of transition from that physical distribution to the logistics component?
Well, my thesis was called industrial logistics. I guess I was thinking of it early on.
Okay.
And if I pulled that thesis off the shelf, I think I have a diagram in there of the inbound and outbound processes. And I've always really thought of it in that fashion. Maybe it was the military background of Gayton Germain that encouraged me in that regard. Can't remember. But I've always used that term, even when we were obviously in the early days of the National Council of Physical Distribution Management. It always seemed to me that distribution was one side of the coin, but there was another side as well.
When you look back at Ohio State and the majority of your career was at Harvard, of all the things you've done, and there's quite a number of those, what do you think, from your perspective, do you think was the most significant?
I think we're probably, those of us who do things like this, as you do, probably the least qualified to name the most significant. The one that probably has had the biggest impact on my career, given the fact that about the first half of that career has been in logistics and the second half in service management. I think probably the most significant for me was putting together a set of ideas that had been posed by others into something I called the service profit chain, going back in the early 80s. I was actually sent to Switzerland to close down an executive program on behalf of the Harvard Business School. And sitting in that office over there for a year up on the mountainside with cows looking in through the window, I had a lot of time to think about things and basically put together this set of ideas that resulted in a book that I wrote called Managing in the Service Economy, that outlined a couple of things. First of all, a strategic service vision, a kind of a framework for thinking about strategy. And then this set of relationships in which basically employee satisfaction, commitment, and loyalty drives customer satisfaction, loyalty and commitment, which in turn drives profit. Relationships weren't proven until later, that is mathematically, but it seemed to me that that was the right set of relationships. It has provided another 20 years of research, which for an academic is like red meat,
Sure.
I guess.
So, Jim, as you look back at your career, and it's still continuing, you're still involved in working, what do you think will be viewed by others as your most significant contribution?
I suspect it's probably this work around the service profit chain. I have the feeling that what I did in logistics was not nearly as significant as what some of my colleagues at other schools had done. Some of the earliest influential thinking in the field for me was a study that was done in 1954, ironically at the Harvard Business School, on air freight and total distribution or something.
The economics of air freight, Culleton, Steele, those folks?
James Culleton and a guy named Steele, right. I don't think I ever met them. That was influential for me. I suspect it was influential for a couple of guys at Michigan State, Ed Smike and Don Bowersox, who then came out 2 or 3 years later with what I thought was a terrific book, Physical Distribution Management, perhaps, and one that was in sync with what I was doing in my thesis work at that point. I had finished my thesis, and maybe their book came out in '59, I'm not quite sure. But it confirmed in many ways what I was thinking about, and certainly influenced Nick Glasgowski and Bob Ivey and myself when we did our first book in business logistics, which was '62. We were not pioneering much of anything in terms of ideas, but extending ideas that were being developed, I think, quite rapidly and successfully by people on other campuses.
Now, you mentioned that at Stanford you met Ivy, Nick Glasgowski, and so forth. How did that relationship continue after Stanford, particularly into a book?
Nick had moved on to the University of Minnesota, I believe, and we continued to correspond. I went back to Stanford to teach in a summer program so that there was still some relationship there, and we decided that my thesis, I believe, might contain the seeds of a book, but that it was not publishable the way it was written. And so we actually went about this in a very workmanlike way. We rented an office in Menlo Park, California, and Bob and Nick and I had office space, and we literally sat there writing chapters and passing material back and forth for a summer. I believe it was the summer of '61, if I'm not mistaken. Essentially hammered out the book that was then published in the subsequent year. We've since drifted apart. Nick has retired. I've lost track of Bob. But for those few years, we did maintain that relation.
Did you have a book contract, or was that something you submitted to Ronald Press and others after the book was written?
I think we had a contract. I can't remember how that process came about, but I don't think we wrote a manuscript and submitted it.
Okay. Now, as you look at your career, and again, we know you're still active, is there something that at this point in your career you say, I wish I would have done this?
Oh, there are a lot of things that I can say I wish I had done. I wish I would have written that Smike Bowersox book, for one thing, or the Culleton Steele book, for that matter. But I suspect I would have liked to, and I may still have a chance to correct this, I would have liked to have done more in the corporate culture and performance area. I did the one piece of work with John Cotter. It was of the sort that I like to do. That is actually kind of putting together systematic anecdotal research based on database examination, which that book was all about. I think there is still a good piece of work to be done in that area. But that's sort of the latest thing that I wish I had. I wish I had built to last or good to great, as far as that goes.
You mentioned Gaten Germain in masters and PhDs being a mentor and influencer. Did you have any mentors once you were a faculty member?
I had several at Ohio State. I think clearly Bill Davidson, Art Kullman were quite effective. Stayed in touch with both of them throughout Art's life, and still am in touch with Bill Davidson in his retirement. Lou Stern was not so much a mentor as a close colleague. We did some writing together. Lou went on to Northwestern. There was a really supportive atmosphere at Ohio State that helped me, I think, do what I was able to do. At Harvard, I think the role of mentor was passed on to, in a sense, to then Dean George Baker. Gayton Germain had been a student of George Baker's.
Ah, interesting.
And Gayton essentially provided the introduction, if you will, that probably led to my ultimate appointment. But after I arrived at Harvard, George Baker continued to provide advice in his fatherly, stentorian, Brahmin tones. And I'll never forget, one day he called me in and he said something I'll never be able to understand. He said, "You've completed the requirements for a full professorship, but you're too young. You're going to have to wait another couple of years." I never quite understood that.
Interesting philosophy that still exists, I believe. In terms of people, events, all those things, what do you think was the biggest and most significant event that took place as a faculty member that has influenced you?
I think there have been many, but I suppose the offer from Harvard for this reason. First of all, it enabled me to do more and I think better work in the whole area of case development because of the orientation of the school and the fact that it's a school with not many limits on resources. The limits at that school are time, not money. You can basically do what you're capable of doing. There are no excuses. And resource, availability of resources is not an excuse up there. I think that probably has influenced me as much. But, of course, that wouldn't have been possible without Ohio State. So.
Now, do you think in terms of the way you have conducted your professional life, have you done that with some basic either mission statement or creed or philosophy?
Well, I basically operated from 5-year plans, which hardly ever turn out the way you plan. I've played a long-term administrative role at the Harvard Business School, and I probably would not have had that in my plan up until the time I was asked to become a part of a track that would lead into administration. At one time I was the senior associate dean responsible for all the academic programs at the school, which was probably the biggest job I had during this time. But over a period of at least 15 years, played a major role in administration that factored into the plan going forward. But the idea has always been to plan in terms of courses, in terms of influencing students, and various phases of this career have sort of been chunked out in different areas. I'm sure there was a conscious decision to move from logistics to services, for example. And then coming out of retirement in 2002, I then had a 5-year chunk in entrepreneurial management. So I suppose in a sense, if I went back, there'd be a pattern there. And certainly there was conscious planning.
Now, you mentioned Harvard with the sort of limitless resources. Do you think that was the ideal job for you? Or could it have been something else?
Well, it certainly could have been something else, but one reason why it was ideal was that, on the one hand, we had courses in which there were teaching groups that worked closely together, and they helped me learn the ropes. First-year marketing was one of those courses. On the other, I was teaching this second-year logistics course, which was mine. And so I had both the structure on the one hand, but I had the freedom on the other. And over the years, it was the freedom, I think, that I really came to value. As people say, you make your own way there. There isn't a lot of instruction. So a relatively free-form environment, I think, it appealed to me.
Now, Jim, shifting gears for a moment, in some of your early comments, you mentioned some interesting terms, being a prince and a king. You mentioned taking your future wife to a professor's home with discussion groups and so forth. I want to talk a little bit about the personal side of Jim Heskett. Tell us a little bit about your family, your wife. Do you have children and so forth? What are they doing?
I met my wife in college. I think it was during my senior year, as a matter of fact, maybe a little earlier. Went off to the Army. Upon arriving in Europe and seeing what great possibilities there were there, I wrote back to her and invited her to come to Europe and get married. So we were married in Austria. We had a church wedding in Germany, and
so you proposed through the mail?
I proposed through the mail.
Interesting.
Yes. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I think maybe I proposed in Indianapolis. I'm not sure, but that was kind of an indefinite engagement, as I recall. I actually wrote the letter from Europe and said, "Why don't you come over?" That was 54 years ago. So we were married in 1955. We've had 3 children: a daughter Sarah, and a son Charles, and a son Ben. Our daughter Sarah is a librarian who lives in Cambridge with us. Not with us, but she lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our son Ben is an entrepreneur out in San Francisco in kind of the high-tech world. And our son Charles is in a buyout firm in New York with good buyout opportunities and very little credit available to engineer the transaction. We lived in and around Cambridge and Belmont, Massachusetts during most of that time after having moved from Columbus. We've had a wonderful life together, still are, and enjoy combining a little work with a daily walk on the beach.
I've noticed in several of your books you've dedicated to your wife.
Yes.
Now, when your children were small and growing up, what was your main goal as a parent for them?
As most of us have experienced, children can be pretty rebellious, and Marilyn and I decided fairly early on that our main goal was to remain friends with our children for their entire lives and our entire lives, and that's what we've really tried to do. I think we're on track, but one never knows for sure, you know.
Some have said that children go through a rebellious period, but then by the time they turn 30, they come back.
Yeah.
But
I think that's true to some extent.
So when you look at your children, none of them are involved in your profession. They're doing other things. What do you think was the biggest influence you had on them?
I would hope that it really had to do with a certain amount of integrity and a responsibility toward others, the value of close friends, and maintaining the quality of those relationships. I would hope maybe a work ethic. There were a lot of days when I was out early and home late or not home at all. We've both experienced those on travel days and the like. But nevertheless, an effort not to be gone for more than 2 or 3 nights maximum. We arrived at that goal pretty early on, and to try to be there for dinner at night, which turned out to be, I think, a very important element of what we did. Also breakfast, but breakfast was always more helter-skelter with kids going to school and the like. Nevertheless, a certain regularity and a certain kind of level of integrity in one's life.
The Supply Chain Doctor interviews thought leaders and visionaries who have had an impact on the field of supply chain management, shares professional development content for practitioners, and investigates current and future trends in the industry. Interested in sponsoring this show to help get your message out? Send a note to chris@thescdr.com. Thank you for listening.